So in the last lecture, we talked about arguments, what they are, and I gave a very sort of high-level overview of ways to evaluate arguments, ways to see whether they are in fact good arguments. And the first one of those I talked about, or the first one I mentioned, was distilling an argument. That's what I want to talk about in this lecture. It's a pretty simple thing to do, but I think oftentimes it'll be pretty revealing of whether an argument is a good one. So, distilling an argument. So an argument, you have a series of claims, the premises, and those claims are supposed to support another claim, the conclusion. As we'll see, you might actually have sub-arguments. One argument leads to a conclusion, which is a premise in the next argument, and so on down the line. Things get a bit complicated, which is honestly one of the reasons we distill arguments. You distill an argument by putting the premises and conclusion in a logical order, an order that makes sense. All the premises listed, then the conclusion at the end. And sometimes, if one premise is supposed to support the next one, well, then you want to put it in front of the one it's supposed to support, right? Distilling an argument, one of the things we're trying to do is to show what the premises are, what the conclusion is, but also how they all fit together, right? Here is an incredibly simple argument. It's so simple it's kind of dumb, right? Who in the world needs to be told this, right? Mammals aren't the only warm-blooded animals. Birds are also warm-blooded. Warm-blooded means, you don't just have whatever temperature the air around you has. You're, hotter than that a lot of times, right? Mammals are warm-blooded. Birds are also warm-blooded. So birds aren't mammals, so mammals aren't the only warm-blooded animals. Now notice the way this argument is constructed, right? What is the conclusion and where is the conclusion? Conclusion is mammals aren't the only warm-blooded animals, right? So when you distill this, you want to put the conclusion at the end. So premise 1, birds are warm-blooded. Premise 2, birds aren't mammals. So mammals aren't the only warm-blooded animals. Now look, for this particular argument, it doesn't matter what order you put the premises in. You've only got two. Two could be one. One could be two. It doesn't really matter. Sometimes when the argument does have a more complicated structure, and we'll look at one in a minute that does, it matters a bit more how you arrange the premises. Sorry, this is a really simple one, but it's always best to start simple, right? One downside with simple is you're like, well, an argument this simple, who even needs to talk about it? Is just dumb, right? That's true. Just trying to give you an idea how this works, though, with a simple example. All right. So why distill arguments? Well, for one thing, it helps us to identify the conclusion. In good writing, especially good writing that's any length, you will really, really emphasize the conclusion. A well-written argument, especially an essay or a paper or a newspaper article that's arguing for something, if it is well-written, it'll probably have the conclusion at the beginning and restated at the end. If you want to convince somebody of something, don't try to sneak up on them. Tell them what you were arguing for. Good writing usually gives you some idea of the conclusion in the introduction and then again toward the end, right? Well, but guess what? not everyone is a good writer, right? Not every philosopher is a good writer. Definitely not everybody in the real world is, right? So, a lot of times people will bury their conclusion in the middle of an argument. Sometimes they might give you a whole argument and they might not even be clear about what the conclusion is. You're just supposed to, draw the conclusion from what they tell you. So, distilling in a world where people are bad writers, which is the world we sadly live in, and don't make their conclusion as clear as it should be, distilling will help us figure out what the conclusion is. It also shows the structure of an argument. It shows you how the premises are supposed to support the conclusion. Now look, in this argument, the structure is so simple you don't need that help, right? We'll look at an argument in a second where you might need that help, right? Finally, once we've sorted the premises out, we can kind of look at them individually, piece by piece, right? When you read an argument that's not a good argument, you probably have this vague sense, okay, this is just not good, right? Or maybe it's not a terrible argument, but there's something about it that fails to be convincing. What distilling an argument will do, a lot of times we'll say, okay, what's wrong with this argument is this one premise seems to be false, or this one premise, maybe it's not obviously false, but it needs a lot more support. So distilling arguments helps us to see whether the argument is a good one, and if it isn't, it helps us to pick out what premises we either don't accept or what premises need more work. Let me give you an example. Look at this sort of monster argument from the beginning of class, right? I mean, it's not that big of a monster argument if you actually read long papers. Sometimes they'll have a lot more premises. They'll be a lot longer than this, right? But this is pretty long. This is pretty detailed. We shouldn't let students take classes in economics to satisfy their gen ed requirement in science. Real sciences can make accurate predictions in the area they study. Chemists can predict what happens when you combine two chemicals. Astronomers can predict things like eclipses and where the planets will be in the sky. And meteorologists can predict tomorrow's weather. But economists can't make accurate predictions about the economy. They can't even tell you when the next recession will start or what the stock market will close at tomorrow. So economics isn't a real science, which is why econ classes shouldn't satisfy the science requirement. All right. Rereading this one, very long argument, a lot going on here, right? This is this argument distilled, right? Conclusion, we shouldn't let students take economics classes to satisfy gen ed requirements. You see that here at the beginning and at the end. This is at least well written enough that, different wording, but you see the conclusion, beginning and end of the argument, right? And one thing you'll do often when distilling an argument, a lot of times there's just a lot of verbiage, a lot of things you can drop, a lot of things that aren't important to the argument. Those won't appear when you distill it. All right. Think about the rest of the structure of the argument, right? You look here, real sciences can make accurate predictions in the area they study. Well, this is before all that stuff about chemists predicting what happens with things like eclipses, meteorologists, and all that. But these claims are supposed to support that one, right? These give you reason to think that real sciences can do that. So, all of this stuff should probably come before this claim, real sciences can make accurate predictions in the area they study, right? Even though it comes after it when it's written down here, in the actual argument, this is one is supposed to support two. So chemists can predict what happens when they combine two chemicals. Astronomers can predict things like eclipses and where the planets will be in the sky, and meteorologists can predict tomorrow's weather. All that supports this second premise: real scientists can make predictions in the area they study. Make accurate predictions. Well, again, look at the argument. These are out of order. Economists can't make accurate predictions about the economy. They can't even tell you when the next recession will start or what the stock market will close at tomorrow. Well, again, in the argument, economists can't make accurate predictions comes before all this stuff about them not being able to tell you what the stock market's going to do or when we're going to have another recession. But obviously, the stuff about them not being able to make these predictions is supposed to support this more general claim, well, they can't make accurate predictions. So 3 should come before 4. 5, economics isn't a real science. 6, we shouldn't allow it to satisfy the gen ed requirements, right? So this is a complicated one. I'm not going to give you guys anything this complicated to start with, but hopefully you guys can see why I reordered the premises in the way I did. 2 comes before 1 in the actual way that this is written out, but 1 is supposed to support 2, so when you distill it, put 1 before 2, right? 3 comes after 4 in the way it's written, but again, 3 is supposed to support 4, so put it before when you write the argument out. By doing this, we get a better idea how this is all supposed to hang together, right? And you get a better idea of whether you think these premises are acceptable on their own or not, right? Is it, you might start to doubt here, is it really, how accurate are meteorologists, right? Look at premise 1, how good are they at really predicting the weather? Is it the mark of a science, that it always can make accurate predictions? Does 3 give us enough evidence for 4? Or might it be the case that economists can actually make some pretty good predictions sometimes, right? So start to look at all of these, maybe we need more evidence for some. Maybe some of them don't seem that plausible when they're put out like this. So I think, by distilling an argument, you can start to see whether it works or not, and if it doesn't, where it's weak, where it might go wrong.